Okay, so today we're diving into social movements. I mean, we've all seen those images, right? Protests, marches, those powerful moments when people stand up for what they believe in.
Yeah, definitely.
But today we're going deeper, way beyond just those headlines. You shared a really interesting mix of stuff with me: sociology readings, news articles, even some pieces on digital activism.
It's a fascinating topic.
Oh, absolutely. So get ready, because by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand how these movements actually work, why they matter, and you might even see yourself as part of one without even realizing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's funny because when we think of social movements, we often picture these massive rallies.
Yeah, huge crowds.
Exactly. But the sources you shared, they emphasize that it's so much more than that. Everyday actions, volunteering, donating, even just learning about an issue. All of those things contribute to social change.
It's true. It's like each person is like a thread in this giant tapestry of change.
Great analogy.
And your sources actually compare this to what happened with the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street. These weren't just movements of like the poorest of the poor, right? It was people in the middle too, whose needs weren't being met,
Yeah,
whose expectations were dashed. It's like things reached a boiling point.
exactly. There's a sociologist, James C. Davies. He argued that real change often comes not from the very bottom, but from somewhere in the middle. When people who were once comfortable start feeling the squeeze, that's when things can really shift.
And Occupy Wall Street is such a perfect example of that. I mean, those images of protesters camped out in Zuccotti Park are like seared into our collective memory. But what's interesting is how Occupy defied all the traditional expectations of a movement. There wasn't one single message or a clear leader.
Right, and that actually left a lot of people confused trying to figure out what it was all about.
Totally.
Because it wasn't about a list of demands,
Yeah.
It was about this deep frustration with growing income inequality and the outsized influence of corporations on
It was
politics.
like a feeling in the air.
Yes. And remember that statistic from one of your sources. The top 1% in the U.S., they captured 58% of economic growth, while wages for the average worker barely increased.
Crazy, right?
Yeah, that kind of disparity is a breeding ground for these kinds of movements.
Absolutely. And then you've got the CEO pay ratio, which has just ballooned. It's 350 times the average worker's salary now. Back in 1983, it was less than 50 times. I mean, that's a massive gap.
Huge.
It makes you wonder, like, have I participated in a social movement without even realizing it? Think about the causes you care about. Have you donated, volunteered, or even just like educated yourself about an issue?
All of those actions, even the seemingly small ones, they can contribute to the momentum of social change. It's like each act adds a little more fuel to the fire.
Okay. So in a way, we're all these like mini activists, right?
Yeah, I like that. Many activists.
But your sources, they get even more specific, breaking down social movements into different types and levels.
Right. There's this sociologist, David Aberle. He categorized social movements based on two things: what they're trying to change and how much change they're aiming for.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got your reform movements, which want to adjust specific parts of the system, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving or the Human Rights Campaign. They're pushing for changes within the existing framework.
Exactly. Then you have revolutionary movements, which are far more radical. They want to completely overhaul society.
Big changes.
Yeah. Think about the counterculture movement of the 1960s or even anarchist collectives. They're not looking for tweaks. They want a whole new system.
And what about groups like Texas Secede, the ones that want to break away from the U.S. entirely? That's got to be a revolutionary movement, right?
Definitely a bold example.
Yeah.
And it highlights that these movements, they operate on different levels.
Yeah.
Local, state, even global. Think about the Fair Trade movement or the International Federation of Organic Agriculture movements. They're aiming to change systems on a worldwide scale.
Wow. It makes you wonder, what kind of movements are most active in your own community or state? What issues are people passionate about where you live?
That's a great question to consider. Here's where things get really interesting. Your sources, they take us through the entire life cycle of a social movement, from its very beginnings to its potential decline.
Yeah, there are these 4 stages, right? Preliminary,
Yeah.
coalescence, institutionalization,
Yeah.
and then decline. And it's crazy to think about how much technology, especially social media, has changed each of these stages.
Oh, absolutely. Social media has revolutionized how movements spread and gain momentum.
Huh.
Think about how fast movements like #MeToo or Black Lives Matter went global. It's mind-blowing.
It's true. It's like social media acts as this accelerant. It makes people aware of issues faster. It helps leaders emerge, and it allows people to organize in ways that were like unimaginable before. A great example is Obama's 2008 campaign. It was like a case study in social media organizing. They used online platforms to connect with voters, raise money, and get people out to vote. It completely changed the game.
And then there's Me Too. It started as a simple MySpace post by Tarana Burke back in 2006. But years later, it exploded into this global movement thanks to the power of Twitter.
It's amazing how these things take off.
It really is. And the thing about social media is it allows individuals to connect and organize in ways that bypass traditional gatekeepers.
That's so powerful.
It is.
But of course, it's not all, sunshine and roses. Your sources also point out that social media can complicate things. Like a hashtag doesn't always represent a formal organization. And just because someone supports a cause online doesn't mean they agree with every aspect of the movement.
Exactly. There's this tension between a decentralized online presence and the need for structured organizations. It's one of the most fascinating things about modern social movements.
So with all this complexity, how do sociologists even begin to make sense of it all? I mean, they've developed all sorts of theories, but your sources seem to focus on three key ones.
Right. They're the ones that offer a particularly helpful lens for understanding how movements work. Resource mobilization theory, framing, frame analysis, and then new social movement theory. Yeah, you're right. There are a ton of theories out there. But the ones highlighted in your sources, they offer a really useful framework for understanding how these movements gain traction, and make an impact.
Okay, so let's start with resource mobilization theory. It sounds pretty straightforward. Like, movements need resources, money, people.
To be
successful. Right.
Exactly. It might seem obvious, but it's crucial. The civil rights movement is a classic example of this theory in action. Think about the role of churches. They provided the infrastructure, meeting spaces, communication networks, a ready-made audience. Then you have leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who could inspire and mobilize people.
Powerful speakers.
Yes. And of course, groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality. CORE, they emerge, channeling energy and resources into specific actions, campaigns.
So it's not just about, having a righteous cause. You need that organizational muscle to make it happen, to turn that passion into real change.
Precisely. Now, framing, or frame analysis. This focuses on how movements use language and messaging to shape public perception. It's about defining problems, offering solutions, and motivating people to take action.
Okay, so it's like creating a lens through which people view the issue.
Exactly. Think about the debate over marriage equality. Both sides use framing to try and sway public opinion.
Right. You had one side saying marriage is between a man and a woman, appealing to, tradition and religious beliefs.
And the other side countered with love is love, focusing on equality and human rights.
Yeah.
In both sides, they use those frames not just to define the problem, but to offer solutions. One side arguing for the preservation of traditional marriage, the other advocating for legal recognition of same-sex unions. And each side used their framing to try and motivate people to act, whether it was donating to a cause, voting for certain candidates, or even just talking to friends and family about the issue.
It's so interesting how much language matters in shaping those public conversations. Now, what about new social movement theory? This one sounds a bit more, philosophical.
It does delve into deeper motivations. New social movement theory recognizes that movements in the post-industrial era, they're often about more than just tangible resources or specific policy goals. They're about identity, culture, and challenging those power structures that shape our lives.
So movements like environmental justice or transgender rights.
Exactly. These movements are often driven by a sense of collective identity. People coming together not just because they share a grievance, but because they share values, experiences, a way of seeing the world. And they challenge the power dynamics that marginalize certain groups, whether it's based on gender identity, race, or even a relationship with the natural world.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground here, from everyday acts of activism to global movements, from the nuts and bolts of how movements organize to the theories behind them. It's incredible how much depth there is to this topic.
It really is. And it highlights just how complex and multifaceted social movements are. It's not as simple as, a group of people getting together and demanding change. There are layers upon layers of strategy, messaging, underlying social forces at play.
But here's what I find really empowering. It shows that change is possible, that ordinary people can come together and through their collective action, make a real difference in the world.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of social movements. They're a testament to human agency, our capacity to imagine a better world and work together to bring it about.
But of course, with any powerful force, there are always challenges, right? Your sources also touch on some of the potential downsides of modernization and technology. You know that whole idea of cultural lag, where technology advances faster than our ability to adapt and deal with the consequences?
Right, like how cyberbullying has emerged as this new form of aggression with potentially devastating effects. And it's not just limited to kids. Adults are targets too.
Yeah, and it's not just cyberbullying. Your sources also point out how technology can create like a digital divide, leaving some people behind because they don't have access to the latest devices or a reliable internet service.
Exactly, which can end up widening the gap between the haves and have-nots, exacerbating existing inequalities. So while technology can be this incredible tool for social change, we have to be mindful of its downsides too.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about technology. But your sources also highlight other factors that can drive social change, like social institutions, population shifts, and even the environment.
Right, and all of those things, they're all interconnected.
Right.
A change in one area can trigger changes in others. It's like a complex ecosystem.
That's a good way to put it. And your sources actually use Hurricane Katrina as a really powerful example of this. I mean, the hurricane itself was devastating, but what really magnified the impact was this, like convergence of factors, the environment, technology, social institutions, demographics. It all came together in this perfect storm of social upheaval.
Exactly. The failure of the levees exposed a lack of investment in infrastructure, which disproportionately impacted low-income communities, right? And then you had the inadequate response from FEMA, which further amplified the suffering and displacement. And it all unfolded in this incredibly public way, thanks to the rise of 24-hour news and citizen journalism, fueled by those early social media platforms. It really showed how all these different forces can interact and create these moments of profound social change.
It's a stark reminder that we can't just address social problems in isolation. We need to look at the bigger picture, understand how all these different systems and forces influence each other.
Absolutely. Now, your sources also touch on this concept of modernization. Society is becoming more technologically advanced and specialized. And while it's often seen as progress, they raise some thought-provoking questions about the potential downsides.
Yeah, like how all those time-saving devices we have haven't actually reduced the amount of time we spend on housework. It's kind of ironic.
Right, and how the constant connectivity of the digital age can blur the lines between work and personal life, leaving people feeling stressed and burnt out.
Always plugged in, always on.
Exactly. And then there's the danger of falling into this trap of ethnocentric bias, assuming that all societies should aspire to be like the most technologically advanced nations.
That's a great point.
So it's a good reminder to be critical of our assumptions about progress, to recognize that it's not always linear or universally beneficial.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Social movements, social change, all these different theories and forces at play. I think the main takeaway is that it's all incredibly complex and nuanced.
It really is. It's this intricate web of interconnected factors. Technology, demographics, environmental changes, the evolution of social institutions. It's all intertwined.
And understanding all of that is essential if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. So as you continue to engage with the causes you care about, remember that you're part of something much bigger, a much larger tapestry of social change.
Yeah.
Your actions, big or small, they can ripple outward, contribute to the momentum. It's inspiring, isn't it?
It is. That power we all have to shape the world around us.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into social movements.